And here we go. We are live and welcome. Good day, good morning, good evening, good night. Wherever in the world, it is evening for myself, and I believe for my awesome guest. It's approximately 7 p.m. Eastern here in Canada. And welcome back to Six Elemental Interviews on my channel, The Drag King Saga. And tonight I have a really spectacular guest, someone whose work I definitely admire. He's a fabulous author and creative podcaster. If you check out my list on Before We Go blog of my top reads for 2025 for traditionally published science fiction and fantasy, and for indie, you will see his work figuring prominently there. It was awesome. I had a blast. I was humbled to get an advanced reader copy of his work. So tonight we're going to learn all about the phenomenal Sam HALE. Welcome, Sam. How you doing?
I'm doing great and jubilant at this point. I think that's the most hyped up I've ever been. PL, it's awesome now.
Well, you deserve the hype, my friend. Again, you are a brilliant author and a wonderful person to boot. But yeah, I was blown away by the level of craft. This is a debut, of course, and congratulations. That's probably, I would be remiss. First of all, congratulations on the release of books 1 and 2 for the Lines of Carthage. Like, that's huge to bring out 2 books of that size. That's impressive. So, but we're gonna talk all about that. But I have to say that I wasn't quite sure what to expect when we first started talking. And I mean, I love the concept you were explaining what the books were about, but I actually think that in a positive way, it actually wasn't what I expected when I started reading. And it's not that your pitch wasn't fabulous, and it's not that the concept that you laid out didn't sound intriguing. It was just that I was like, wow, this is friggin' amazing. And it's got this almost like steampunk vibe. And I don't know if that's what you intended, but that's kind of the vibe that I was picking up. And I mean, I want to hear how you as the author describe your work, but I'm quickly going to read what I wrote about your book in my top books of the year list, where you are featured on that list for book 1 of Lines of Carthage, a Hannibal book epic. And I said, if you're a history nerd like me, you love the Punic War period, don't sleep on this exciting new series by Sam HALE with some of the most impeccable research behind it. We'll also talk about that later. Mythology meets fact, meets the fantastical as an alternate 146 BCE with a steep, semi-steampunk vibe, blend with the heroic feel of classics such as the Iliad, brings us gods, demigods, fabled warriors, slaves, war machines, and epic battle scenes. It's set in the backdrop of the fall of Carthage at the hands of ancient Rome. And when the Numidians show up, now, you know the Numidians,
Yeah, we're talking about Numidians, yeah.
Yeah, the things really go bonkers. Absolutely love this book. Allows for complete immersion in the stunning world building while providing action sequences that will keep you on the edge of your seat. So I didn't do justice to your book. However, why don't you start us off by telling us, in your words, what these 2 books are about?
Yeah, so Lines of Carthage, the Hannibalic epic, is, in a nutshell, what I'm calling Homeric fantasy. Somebody probably has already coined that, but it takes place immediately after the Third Punic War, which is the last in a vicious series of wars between the Roman Republic and a nation called Carthage in northern Africa. It's in modern-day Tunisia. And I call it Homeric fantasy because I based it in terms of the violence, in fact, which I go for as kinetic a kind of violence as I can. I think of violence as a form of communication. I go for a very Homeric kind of violence, as well as speech and sometimes narrative that blends into purple prose. And the whole premise was, can I take an ancient story and an ancient conflict that I find intriguing and invite the modern reader, who may not even be aware of this, into this world where there are divine mechs. Some people call it steampunk. I've been calling it something like divine punk, where there are demigods. Some pilot these massive mechs. We call them archons. And you can see the archons on the cover of both books in one. getting to both books in one, it's one and two. It's actually one book. If you look at book two, there's an author's note. You didn't get this version because you had draft 8, and thank you for slogging through a pretty nasty draft of that thing. I did a total of 15, so you took a hit for the team, PL. But it's actually written as one book, and that is why when you get book one, it's 820 pages, and book two is 300. So as a whole, the project was to educate, obviously to express myself, but to educate readers, and in the process, hopefully generate some empathy about the ancient world and what it's like to survive something as cataclysmic as a siege breaking in a city you're living in. And yeah, hopefully I conveyed that. I think I did. Enough people have read it and told me I did.
Yeah, you absolutely nailed it. It was spectacular. And again, for you and I chatted a bit about, we kind of geeked out about the historical aspect. When I spoke to you on your podcast, and just for edification, people watching, I had the privilege of being on Sam's podcast, which we'll talk about later in terms of what he does in that space. But, we're both history nerds, and we're kind of like starting to like spout off. And I think anybody else listening that wasn't their thing, they're probably like, oh my gosh. But that's both of our things. So it was great to have that common bond about that. So I think perhaps if we can dial in, first of all, in terms of your work, why did you choose that specific period in history to write about? What fascinates you about that period of history? You could have chosen any period of history. You're very knowledgeable, I think, in general about all things historical. So what made you choose that period?
That's there's a short version and a really long one. I'll try and keep it short, which is I just find this whole story takes place in the Mediterranean basin, specifically in North Africa. And I just had so little knowledge of history in that area that extended beyond the Spartans, for example, or the Roman Empire. I didn't even know prior to writing Locke, Lines of Carthage, before writing Locke, that the Roman Empire was preceded by a republic, and before that, a kingdom. And that the Republic period, or Republican period of Rome, is a fascinating one.
Yes.
And so immediately, I found myself compelled to learn more about it, because what happened is I listened to Dan Carlin's Hardcore History podcast, and he had a series called Punic Nightmares. And I didn't even know what Punic meant, let alone who it was associated with. And so I started learning about these people called the Carthaginians, who, as far as Mediterranean hegemony was concerned, were the only competition the Roman Republic had. And so immediately I was struck again by my ignorance, being a product of American public education. My my education is a product of American public education. And so I'm pretty interested in history, so I got to go out of my way to learn these things. But I had no idea any of this stuff took place. Most of us learn about the gods. That's the stuff in the Mediterranean, specifically to the Greeks. So at this time period, I'm writing at, they're called the Hellenes. We all know about the gods, and Zeus throws lightning bolts everywhere, and Hades or Ares is just, perpetually pissed, and all kinds of stuff like that. But I didn't know anything about the actual people, right? And I didn't know the distinction between Macedonians and Hellenes, if there even is one. According to some people, there is none. But if you ask a big fan of Alexander the Great, there's a huge difference. So I started with lack of education that I hoped, in the process of researching this and learning about the Numidians, for example, I had no idea there were nomads in North Africa, for example. I wanted to then share my jubilance and excitement with readers. And as it continued, I just realized, because there's such august figures throughout the Second Punic War in particular, like Scipio Africanus and Hannibal Barca, like these are immensely compelling human beings who accomplished so much, but like almost all figures in Mediterranean history in early, mid, late antiquity, they have nasty, brutish lives. It seems almost proportionate that the greater their accomplishments, the more the more severe their downfall is. Handball being a great example of that. And I just found them to be so startlingly human, and their interactions and the records we have from primary and secondary sources so compelling that I thought there's a story here. And getting to really the meat of it, I've always been really interested in the human experience within extremis, within really extreme situations. And anybody can, I shouldn't say anybody can, but a lot of people write about the battle,
Yeah.
and the war. But my question has always been what happens afterward. And what the Romans did to Carthage, the capital of this entire Punic republic. I've heard some people call it an empire, call it a republic. They had a senate and everything. What happened to the people after Rome razed Carthage to the ground? And that's a question I've had for years, whether learning about 1945 Berlin. Like, what happens in the Reconstruction period? But I don't even get to Reconstruction, because what happened is that 50,000 slaves were taken from Carthage as a sort of plea bargain. They said to the Carthaginians, we'll stop decimating the inside of your city now that we've broken through. But we want 50,000 slaves. And so I thought, well, what happens to the people who lost their family? What do they do? How do they cope with the existential trauma of surviving herbicide, as it's called? And so it's multi-part, but it's education, fascination, and then ultimately blending all those into my form of expression, which is the human condition in various forms of extremis.
Well, that explanation was fabulous. One thing that was percolating with me when I read your work is that I feel, and you correct me if I'm wrong, I feel that there's copious books about, for example, in terms of the period of the Roman Empire, the sack of Rome, and even pre-sack of Rome, say with the Huns. But then we learn sack of Rome, we learn about the Visigoths and all these other tribes. But Carthage is really something that, it's not talked about very much at all. Why do you think that is compared to some other time periods throughout mind you, the Roman Empire stretched for centuries, actually, right? Like but why is Carthage neglected, you think, amongst all of these other places and or tribes that are linked to the Roman Empire's long history?
I mean, the most obvious example is that the most obvious reason is Rome was so committed and thorough in their destruction of Carthage that they spent 17 days after evacuating the city, 17 days tearing it down, literally brick by brick. Brick that had been scorched to the point where it was carbonized, turned red, it was useless. And I mentioned that in the book, as some of these people are trying to rebuild parts of Carthage, they just say we can't even use the brick. So the Romans destroyed almost everything we have about the Carthaginians in terms of the historical record. Their material culture also disappeared because 199 years after Carthage was destroyed, the Romans resettled it. And then it was settled by the Vandals and the Byzantines and the Moors. So over time, these people kept stacking up, and in the process, pushing out all this material culture. So there's the fact that the Romans just utterly decimated them. And unfortunately, we lack even things like receipts. Archaeohistorians, archaeologists love receipts. They tell you so much. How much emmer wheat did Publius buy from the Tyrian merchant, and where was it going, and what was the name of the person captaining this, and who funded this entire mercantile endeavor, etc. It tells you so much. We hardly have any of that for the Carthaginians. We know what their language sounds like, and you can actually hear it in YouTube videos. It has a lot of glottal clicks that is somewhat similar in certain regards to Arabic, and that it's got a bit of click to the back of it. And we have that courtesy of the city of Melkart, Melkart being one of the Phoenician gods. And so we have these things, but Carthage just aside from the Roman destruction of Carthage, we just don't seem to be all that interested in any of the people Rome conquered. Their star was so ascendant and burned so bright that it just flash fried anybody who was associated with them. Like, they have an immense amount of interaction with the Gauls. That's in modern day France, Belgium, northwestern Italy, portions of northeastern Spain. It is a massive, massive patch of land. One of the issues with that is the Gauls don't have any written material culture. So there is that, but simultaneously, nobody really knows who the Gauls are. And it's a hard question to answer at the sort of racial / ethnic level. Like, who are the Gauls? Are the Celts? Are the Gauls Celtiberians? Cisalpine Gauls, blah, blah, blah. But everywhere Rome went, and in this case, it's Caesar committing to a genocidal campaign or pacification of Gaul. He writes about them. Caesar writes about the Gauls, but it's not so much an ethnographic survey like a cultural anthropologist might conduct, but more to just demonstrate Rome's absolute dominance of whomever either brought the fight to them or that Rome decided needed a fight brought to them. And so there's the complete destruction of Carthage in terms of its material culture, not just in the immediate follow-up of the Third Punic War, but just over time as the ruins were then settled and resettled, etc. But also because Rome was so total in its in its hegemony across much of the Mediterranean basin, extending at certain points all the way up into modern day England and Scotland, that we just can't, especially in media, we just can't get past it. The shadow they cast is so large, and the gravity well of the Roman Republic and eventual empire is such that a lot of people just aren't even aware of anything else, because Rome is they just roamed so goddamn hard.
Yeah, no, and that's really well said. The thing is, though, Sam, that is, and you and I talked about this a bit when I spoke to you last time, and I think you'd agree, that is the typical colonial playbook for every major empire since the world began, whether it's the Aztecs, whether it's the British Empire, whether it's, there is this element of culture and history being eradicated, layered, the new empire layering theirs on top, suppressing, that beneath. And then if for some reason yet another empire conquers, then that empire. So, it just repeats itself, right? However, in certain cases, and we understand the reasons for that, for example, you have the Britons who, Rome, they survived, essentially, right? Enough essence of those tribes and the Germanic tribes and the actual Brits survived that, okay, when Rome left, we still have a culture, right? But with Carthage, it's this complete and total almost annihilation. Like what you're talking about, like brick by brick tearing down. Like I would argue that, and again, this is more your period than mine. I do have some knowledge there, but I would argue that of all of the cultures that the Roman Empire essentially eradicated, there seemed to be almost something personal with Carthage. And again, we're going to get into this a bit, because again, this is a Hannibalic epic. You're ready. So the Hannibal looms large in this. But I want to hear your take before, why Carthage? Why was Carthage basically root and stem out?
Well, you touched on it briefly. It's personal. This time it's personal. Yeah. It really is. Starting with the First Punic War, Hannibal's father, Hamilcar Barca, is going to face off with the Scipiones. In the Second War, Hannibal Barca is going to face off with Scipio Africanus. And then the Third War, there's Hasdrubal the Boeotarch, who's the general of Carthage at the time. He's going to face off against Scipio Aemilianus, another Scipione, adopted into the Scipione family by Scipio Africanus. So there is the almost Shakespearean symmetry to it, as these three wars create a kind of generational legacy and trauma that it really is generational trauma. And I briefly even used that exact term in the book, though I didn't want to break verisimilitude in the process. But it truly stems, I believe, from the Second Punic War, wherein Rome had imposed severe war reparations and indemnities on Carthage following the First Punic War, so much so that Hamilcar Barca, so the father of Hannibal, made his son Hannibal, when he was 9 years old, swear an oath to forever be an enemy of Rome. And there are different interpretations of that also, to never be a friend of Rome. I like the more dramatic forms. That's why it's in the book. Just saying you don't want to be somebody's friend doesn't hit as hard. So Hannibal Barca at 9 years old is already, and I've heard it sometimes told as a blood oath that he swore to the god Melkart, sometimes Baal Haman. He's committed to this thing. And so the Barcas commit to a pretty aggressive conquest of what is now eastern Spain, founding their Carthage, their kind of a second capital, almost a Barcid autonomous capital in New Carthage, or Carthago Nova, which is in modern day Cartagena, Spain. So we always get to hear these cool etymological Easter eggs being laid out through the time period. It's fun to research. You know this stuff. It's fun to research just so you can hear it. And then Hannibal, at 25, his father died during a raid that some Celtiberians launched against him. Hannibal, at 25, inherits his father's war machine. Though it's worth mentioning, Carthaginians mostly relied on mercenaries such as the famed Numidian light cavalry, which, as far as that part of the world's concerned, are the elites. They are the African Mongolians, not to be too too disparate in comparisons, but it's personal. Hannibal Barca, Mago, and Hasdrubal Barca, his two brothers, are all going to launch this war that is, in some sense, punching back at Rome for the indemnities laid upon them in the First War. And it would be really easy then to, if we look deeper into how the First Punic War ends and all the stuff levied against Carthage, to just say, well, Rome had it coming. This is all going to get to why just totally level Carthage. But Hannibal then goes on to wage a 17-year war across Italy, Gaul, massive portions of the Western European landmass. And he's going to commit to three battles in particular: the Battle of the Trebia, the Battle of Lake Trasimene, and then his masterstroke, the Battle of Cannae, wherein the lowest estimates I've heard are something like 40,000 Romans slaughtered in a day. Highest being something like 80,000 casualties. So that's POWs as well, stuff like that, though they wouldn't have used a term like that at the time. He created, over the course of 17 years, an amount of animosity plus existential fear that the Romans and the Roman Republic, after that war ended and Hannibal was defeated by Scipio Africanus at the Battle of Zama, outside of Carthage, the Romans just couldn't get over it. And there's one thing that's worth noting. You mentioned the sacking of Rome by the Gauls back in the 4th century BCE, or maybe 5th, I can't recall. And Caesar is going to use the pretense of the Gauls having sacked Rome 400-ish, 300 years prior as pretense for going into Gaul to pacify them. In other words, the Romans have one hell of a memory. And so the Second Punic War wraps up. And throughout this time period, people like Cato the Elder, who was a Roman senator, who fought in the Second Punic War, and it was a scarred veteran, and also an immense war hawk, conservative war hawk within the Roman Senate, he got to the point where he started ending every speech with Carthago delenda est, Carthage must be destroyed. And he would do really pernicious things, like during one speech, he's talking and a fig falls out of his robes. And oh, what's this? And picks it up. And he says, this fig came from Carthage, just 3 days sailing from Rome. And the message there is clear. It's a plump, luscious fig, too. Look at all the wealth that awaits us, and look how close the people who can grow something this perfect are to us. 3 days sailing. But having said that, a lot of those people, like Cato, fought in the Second Punic War and saw their fair share of hell. And just like today, people experience what we'd call shell shock, all kinds of trauma. And a lot of people, pretense aside of raising Carthage and all the slaves and plunder they're going to bring home, a lot of these people did see Carthage as just a barkid brood in waiting. It's only a matter of time before they spew out another Hannibal. And we need to beat them to the punch, because the last time was an existential nightmare we barely survived. So yes, we could talk about, Rome had it coming the way they treated Carthage in the first war. But the way Hannibal treated Rome during the Second War, despite eventually losing, was enough pretense plus legitimate terror that when Rome does wage the Third Punic War in 146 BCE, in the spring of 146 BCE, a lot of the people fighting had lost loved ones in the Second Punic War, had fathers who'd lost limbs or were so scarred they were alcoholics for the rest of their lives, right? And so a lot of people saw this as a noble, worthwhile endeavor, if for no other reason than to preserve the Roman Republic, which all these soldiers are citizen soldiers. These are homegrown, raised from the she-wolf's teat to suckle upon and fight her wars, right? So it's a lot of things, but right down to it, it's plunder plus conquest plus hegemony plus legitimate fear and 20 other things an actual historian could tell you. But all that's to say, Rome just was not going to risk another Hannibal.
Yeah, and that's extremely well said. I felt like, because obviously in your book, there are references to, from the pantheon of gods you can name, like name your god, name your hero from the Aeneid, the Iliad, the Odyssey, this is a mashup of, some of the best elements that you can ask for in a fantasy, quasi-historical, I don't even know how to qualify your book. It is just to say that it's amazing. But and tell me if this is the way you, and of course I may have totally misread it, but this is the way I, as a reader, as I was diving, like specifically the way, and this is linked to what we're just talking about with Carthage. Hannibal, to me, the way you reference it, where the characters now long after the events of the early wars, it's almost like he's this Napoleonic figure that, like the Romans had to, for the sake of their pride, if nothing else, they had to deal with it. It didn't matter, how many men they lost. It didn't matter what the consequences were. They had to, for the Roman Empire to be the big baddie. They had to do it. But when at the time of where your book is set, Hannibal is like, yeah, he's this Napoleonic figure that, essentially almost as if history paints him almost as if he lost that one battle and that was it. But other than that, he was the boogeyman. Is that how you were painting him?
It depends. There is one character, his name's Felix. He's a Roman who regularly reminds the Carthaginian contingent of the cast, there's some alliteration, that the Romans did see him as a Napoleon, if from the point of view of, say, the British Empire. He was an existential threat. And you compared him to Napoleon, which is apropos, given that Napoleon will, in essentially a stunt to emulate Hannibal, also cross the Alps
Yeah.
to sneak into Italy's backyard. And there's a really well-known painting of Napoleon on a great big horse with he's scouting forth, and on the bottom left you can actually see inscriptions, and I believe one of this is Hannibal along with Charlemagne, making references to all these other very august leaders that somebody like Napoleon very much modeled himself off of. But yeah, Hannibal is a totemic figure, not just for the Carthaginians if we're just talking about, diegetically in book, he's totemic for the Carthaginians in the sense that they didn't have one during the Third Punic War and felt that militaristic deficit to their core. He's totemic for the Romans too, because they don't have a Hannibal to butt heads with. And so one of the things about the Third Punic War is it is punitive. In the sense that they're not challenged in the sense they were during the Second Punic War. And one of the things the Romans consistently demonstrate, you can say whatever you want about them, is that they do not shy away from whoever is top dog in that area of the world, wherever it is. They like a challenge. And Caesar's, his commentaries on Gaul are intensely pernicious, because what he'll do as he's going through like a 10-year pacification campaign, I'm using air quotes for people just listening, he will regularly refer to how competent and how savage yet bold and brave the Gauls are. And he'll talk about the leadership, how even though they lack the culture and sophistication of Rome, which is getting a lot of it from the Hellenes, hence the Hellenization of Rome, they're still incredibly admirable, and they put up one hell of a fight. And that's really smart on Caesar's part, because he's doing something that Rome couldn't do during the Third Punic War because they lacked a Hannibal, but did during the Second Punic War, which is they can pump up their foe so that when they defeat him, they look even better, right? It's one thing to say I punched down and beat this guy, but to say I punched up, or at least at eye level with somebody, and we both left with bloody noses, but at the end of the day, he knew who won and who lost. Like the lack of that totemic Barcid figurehead during the Third Punic War is what I think makes it exceptionally tragic, is because these people, many of them within living memory, knew how incredible this man was and how important he was to Carthaginian, not only the securing of their own mercantile hegemony, they were largely in charge via trade, as opposed to the Romans via the gladius, the stabby sword. They were intensely aware of how vulnerable they were. And all it takes is one great leader to change the tide. And what's going to happen is during the beginning of the Third Punic War, there's some incredibly lackluster Roman generalship manning the siege. And it almost looks like at various points, Carthage might just whoop them. If they sally forth, they might be able to pull this thing off. But then what happens to Scipio Aemilianus, the adopted grandson of Scipio Africanus, who defeats Hannibal, shows up and totally shifts the tide. And you hate to see it, but you love to watch because it's so poetic. Like I was saying earlier, it has a Shakespearean symmetry to it. But that's the sad part about the third one, is it's somewhat asymmetrical by the end, because Rome did such an amazing job of essentially demoralizing Carthage, so that by the end of the Third Punic War, they're a shell of their former selves. And it is a tragedy to watch, but that's what makes it so compelling.
And it does. I mean, I think you hit on the head. You articulate so well about this poetic symmetry. I'm reminded, of course, much later period. I am reminded, and of course, in a very much more condensed time frame, I'm reminded of the War of the Roses, where you have the Plantagenets, and then you have the Yorks and the Lancasters splitting off, and this bloodshed. That it almost defies and transcends description, in that they basically eradicated each other to the point where they had to rejoin,
Yeah.
to stop the bloodshed. But and I know it's very different from what we're talking about, but also too, this book, for whatever reason, when I was reading it, this is a period when Rome is still the big baddie. When it's far from the eclipse of Rome. However, it felt very much like this is the end. This is all there is, because they have punched up and they have beaten the big baddie, almost akin to like Gladiator, the movie Gladiator, the 2001 film, where it's like around, I think it's around 180ish, AD, and it seems like now this is we finally conquered the barbarians, right?
Yeah, these Germanic
Yeah,
Huns.
yes,
Yeah.
these Germanic Huns. We've finally done it. The last battle's been fought, and now we can just be this peaceful empire that reigns, without opposition. But in your book, there's a lot of fight left. There's a lot of fight left in the oppressed. But what really seems to be at the heart of the story is this amazing relationship between two of the main characters, and it's complex because one of the main characters is the sister-in-law of the other, and yet they have this burgeoning, it's kind of like almost a romance that we're not sure if it's going to come to fruition. They, both believe that that the brother is dead, which complicates the potential for there to be more than just the friendship and the family dynamic. But those are two characters that they refuse to give up, no matter what is thrown at them. And that captures, I think, the essence of the novels for me, is that the pure perseverance in the face of just the horror, as you said, of everything that's going on. That to me is what this book was all about. That Carthage didn't roll over, man. They fought. They fought to the last. And was that something, in terms of the two main characters as well, that these were just two indomitable people that were just not going to give up no matter what.
Yeah. Well, and one of the things to preface that is I always work with human beings and then flesh them out: man, woman, hopeful, pessimistic, all the things that color us as human beings and the human condition as a whole. I wanted them to represent, like I said, I'm interested in extremes, and I did want to look at extremes. So one of the characters you're referencing, her name is Zosime, which is Greek for something like she who survives, or she who is likely to survive. And I very intentionally slap the label of hope on her forehead. The beginning epigraph in chapter 1 is from Aristotle. It's apocryphal. There's no evidence he said it, but hope is a waking dream. The final chapter in the book is called Hope. And her counterpart, her brother-in-law, Ajax, though that's not his actual name, Ajax Barca, grandson, these are fictional people. There's no evidence that Hannibal even had a son. There's a guy named Haspar, but we're not even sure he actually existed. Ajax being vengeance personified. And when you're talking about this determination, this kind of Punic determination, yeah, it's an examination of how far people are willing to go to achieve a goal. In this case, Zosime wants to rescue her husband, she believes has been enslaved, and Ajax wants to rescue his brother, who he believes has been enslaved. But these are two immensely different people in terms of how their outlook, their worldview, how they solve problems, we'll say. One prefers to headbutt somebody hard enough their face caves in. The other would much rather have a conversation, though Zosime is not at all averse to violence. I do try and keep in mind that this is antiquity. These are still human beings, but a different breed of human being. So oftentimes you'll see things such as slavery and slaves that some of the most likable characters, according to other people, don't even bat an eyelash at. Having said that, yeah, I wanted to. These are the main protagonists. There are a couple others. I don't want to call them secondary, but it's the best way of describing them. But these dual protagonists, I had to have them butting heads at various points so that they could poke holes in one another's ethos and exploit it and cause one another to go, crap, she's right. Or, man, he's making a good point right there. How far am I willing to go to save my husband? Whereas Ajax saying, how much of myself will I give up to save my brother? Or who and what will I destroy to do it? And is he just looking for an excuse to rage? Um, so hope is indomitable in the book, but sometimes the characters are just so determined and using the veil of hope, this guise, the mask, if you will, that they lure themselves into good intentions. And like it's often said, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. In this case, the road to Hades, or I guess it would be Sheol for the Punic peoples.
I think I know it's easy, especially for me, and you have to apologize, to get carried away with the historical aspect. And I think I probably was, because again, I frankly love geeking out about this, and you and I are the same that way. But really, I do want to hone in on how incredible the book was done from a characterization aspect. I mean, say nothing of the action scenes. The battle scenes were just so amazing, just so intense. Just, you have, I don't want to spoil the book, but, the scale and the scope and the type of power of the creatures involved is just next level, right? And on top of that, you still have essentially mortal warriors within that fighting with, mortal implements and weapons, and being dealt mortal wounds that they will die and they can't survive from. And yet you have the macro. So it's just like, and again, I'm really trying hard not to really spoil, because I want people to read this book. This is an absolutely stellar book in every capacity. But quickly going back to the characters, because I'm a character driven reader. You also have and again, I don't want to the characters together too much, again, not to spoil, but you have a character that is trying to save their child. And that becomes in some ways a source of distraction from their mission, because it's hard to protect your child when you're enslaved, for example, when you need to fight. How are you going to protect your child if you don't have people on your side, friends, allies that you can entrust to care for your child? And even then, how are you going to protect your child? You have a character who, and again, I'm really trying hard not to spoil, they are an enemy turned ally. And there's a situation where they have, let's just say, an illness or a disease. And that affects, all of the characters in terms of the threat level. And their fierceness and their, rather volatile, this without this illness or disease, they're already volatile. But then you add this component, the volatility is off the charts, and there's an unpredictability about, will that destroy everything because of, so I think what you did so exceptionally well, was playing off the human emotions of the different relationships. You said at the heart of it, it's a human drama of how all these characters navigate all these situations, and also showing that there's a genuine, in a lot of the characters, there's a genuine humanity and a caring and compassion, despite these outlandish otherworldly powers that a lot of them have, and these situations they're dealing with. They are at their heart, essentially human, and I think that was so well done. And is that something as well that you wanted to convey?
Yeah, absolutely. I found myself reading less and less in the last 5, 6 years or so within spec fic, at least, because I've been more and more disappointed with the lack of characterization, and in tandem with that, not capitalizing on unintended consequences. And so one of the things I think works well when I'm writing characters is I have a terrible short-term memory, and I will write something. It happened a million times during writing Locke, where an I would have a character say or do something, and then I'd be laying in bed at 3 a.m. and realize, oh, that doesn't work because they just talked about that earlier, 2 chapters ago, and him saying, I swear I'll never do this thing. And then he goes and does it. And a lot of my instincts kept saying, oh, well, fix that. You can't have that, Sam. No, you got to fix this, man. It's not consistent. But people aren't consistent. We're intensely capricious when it comes to our motives. We say one thing and do another. I mean, I've been a special ed teacher for 15 years. I tell my kids to behave a certain way, and then I go and do the opposite 5 minutes later. So whenever it came up, with these contradictions came up, I'd say about 75% of the time, I just said, well, let's have them recognize that. Or somebody next to them go, but you said you wouldn't do that thing. And now this person has to wrestle with the human condition and the moral ambiguity of going, crap, I did. And I'm closer to this person than I was, say, one act ago, to speak non-diegetically. And how is that changing me? Because one act ago, I would have just told him to go to hell. But now my feelings are changing a lot toward this person, and I don't know how to handle them. And so you have a lot of people with an almost kind of emotional paralysis. And coming back to it, I needed characters I believed in. And one of the things I'm really grateful for is Locke has, I essentially, when I'm thinking about stories, I just put out a casting call. There are a few characters I create. I could think of like one character, I could name him Syphax.
Yeah.
Syphax is one of the few characters where he's artificial, but even then he started to take on his own person in a way where I was like, oh, you're actually real. Never mind. But when I put out the casting call for Locke, the people who showed up had been waiting since the Big Bang to go, all right, let's get started, man. And they were so real and fleshed out that I felt as though right the first time I started writing some of them, or rather interpreting what they were doing and transcribing. I just call myself a glorified transcriptionist as a writer sometimes. I felt like I could have sat down with these people and had a cup of coffee and talked for 3 hours straight and never felt forced, right? The same way you and I are talking, I could have done that with Ajax the first time I started writing. And I go, oh, I know who this guy is now.
Yeah.
So once they just approached me and read their lines and I went, you're hired. It was so much easier. And then, like I said, playing off of unintended consequences and moral ambiguity and an author with horrible short-term memory, all of that was a nice little cocktail for creating real people. Like, to me, they're real. I don't consider the characters, I know it sounds pretty artsy fartsy and frou-frou, but to me, those are real people. And since I finished that book, I miss them. I miss Zoe's hope. I miss Ajax's determination. I miss Fecto's mustache, all kinds of things. Like, I miss these people dearly. And I plan to continue writing that series, but it took me 7 years to write. And I can't do that again, even though I'm sure I'd write the next book quicker. But I miss them dearly, and that's good. And when I'd write certain chapters where loss is immensely poignant, I'll just put it that way, I couldn't help but tear up as I was writing these things. And I thought, okay, there it is. Because you're actually mourning the loss of somebody real and loved. And I appreciate you saying that about the characters, because if there's one thing I worked the hardest on, it was taking at least 7 different characters and making sure all these disparate threads somehow twine together to make a pretty decent looking rug. And it took a long time. It took about 15 drafts, but I think I got there for the most part. And how they play off of one another over time, I think becomes quite endearing, but also creates even more tension as they start to like each other more, so that every time they do disagree, you go like, oh, but you guys were doing so well, right?
Well, I think you achieved the mission. I too felt as a reader felt there's one outcome where I felt an immense sense of loss. I think you know what I'm talking about,
Yeah.
and the way it was the way it was resolved was brilliant, but yet I was heartbroken. So I think you definitely achieved the goal. I, I just want to say, and I know unfortunately you have only so much time to devote to certain things, but we talked about the book. I think you've done an amazing job of just of basically letting any potential readers know what it is about and why they, if you like this, why you would, this sort of thing, why you would be interested in it and want to pick it up. I do want to really, because we have to make time for both of these aspects in this discussion. How did you become a writer? Why are you a writer? What has your writing journey been like? Why did you decide to self-publish this book, etc.?
Yeah, I mean, the short version is I was going crazy as a teacher. I had written off and on for years, but I wasn't one of those writers who, oh, at 5 years old, I was already writing short stories and stuff. I never did anything like that. The only time I was enthused about writing is when I was writing, say, a history report on Genghis Khan or, Roman gods and stuff like that, Greco-Roman gods. And it wasn't until about 2015 when I went to the Middle East to teach for 2 years that I was so profoundly bored and isolated because we lived in these compounds, which is pretty often for a lot of Westerners in the Middle East to teach or what have you. And I was just so profoundly bored. I mean, literally bored to tears in some sense. All I can say is thank the gods my cat was with me, because otherwise I don't know how I would have made it. But I started writing, and I just remember writing a short story that was just tremendously grim because that's what I do. And I submitted it to Clark's World without realizing that Clark's World pretty much goes for like 14-year-old level maturity, and that's about it. And so I quickly received a canned response saying thanks, but no thanks, man. And so I just kept writing though, because I felt the catharsis emotionally up till that point. I'd gone through a horrendous breakup back in 2011, and I just didn't know what to do with myself. So I came back and I got a master's degree in special ed and started teaching. And while I was content to teach, I didn't feel like I had purpose. I didn't feel as though I was doing something that at at a spiritual level, if we want to get metaphysical, nourished me. So over time, I would chisel away at writing here and there. And then once I got immensely bored in the Middle East, I started writing seriously. I started writing a science fiction story called Ultra Mantis Squad, which is meant to be intentionally absurd. And I might pick that book up again someday. And I just kept writing. And I came back from the Middle East in 2017. I started teaching in the schools proper, and I could not find a writers group to save my life, or one where I didn't have to explain spec fic conventions before they even read it, right? Which is one of the biggest struggles for genres like ours. And so I just said, well, to hell with it, I'll start my own. And so I did, and it was an excellent idea. I've made friends that to this day I still talk with. My editor, Jen, she and I met in my writers group. We talk all the time. We talked 2-3 days ago on Zoom. And I just kept writing and feeling the catharsis. And then in 2018, April of 2018, I heard that Punic Nightmares podcast from Dan Carlin. And I remember I was pacing my kitchen and I just stopped and went, oh, that's the story. And 7 years later, here we are. But I had to write. I mean, I've struggled with things like suicide and intense. At one point, I was in an intensive outpatient program. I had a mental breakdown in about 2020, and I had to stop writing for about a year because I was just a mess. And so throughout this whole time period of coming back from the Middle East, starting my own writers group while continuing to teach, I realized the only thing that was restoring me time and again was writing. I mean, so much so that I would come home from a horrendous day of teaching, because I had one parent in particular that was just a nightmare to work with. And I had a terrible migraine, but I had a ton of writing to do that night. Lance of Carthage, first draft, it was just a beast. I was averaging 3-4 hours a night. And I started writing despite it all, and pushed away from the desk at the end of the session and went, my migraine's gone, right? Like, this never happened before. Usually I have to dose up on my prescription, which reduces my IQ by about 50 points. And I just kept writing, and it felt so good and provided such a potent sense of identity that I don't know what else I'd do with myself if suddenly somebody forbade me from writing for the rest of my life. I'd go crazy. As far as why I self-publish, one of the reasons is talking to people like yourself, as well as a bunch of other guests on the podcast I was hosting for a while. It was called The Author's Preface, TAP for short. And I kept talking with people because I had the misplaced notion, and we don't have time for it, but I have a lot of thoughts on trad publishing. The short version being they're going for quantity over quality, but it is a business, so I understand at some level why that's the case. But the more I talked with all these people, whether trad or self, I started to realize, because for people who aren't aware, Lions of Carthage is a pretty grim book at times. It takes place during a time period that is quite it's nasty, brutish, and short. It's Homeric fantasy, so it is as tragic as to be expected. And it features all kinds of stuff that I started to wonder if any trad publisher would put a bet on, right? Also, I'm a complete unknown. Here's an 1,100-page book. It's going to be incredibly expensive to print. And you're going to have to price it like almost $30 to make any kind of money back. And I just decided, like, I'll just self-publish, because I could spend the next 10 years trying to shop this book. Of course, I'd write other stuff in the meantime, but I just decided I'm going to self-publish this thing, because also it is one book, but that second book is a third the size of the first one. People are going to get that second one, and they kind of do now. They go, what the hell? But that's why the book is priced at like half the first one. I didn't want to be greedy about it. And it's just catharsis, it's purpose. And then self-publishing was at first my only route toward publishing full stop, but after a certain point became a form of liberation. I have thoughts on self-publishing in terms of weights and measures, in terms of standards still. But altogether, it really was my only option. There was no way Locke was going to get published. Tor would never publish Locke in a million years. So a lot of reasons. I hope I answered all these questions. Again, terrible short-term memory.
No, you did a wonderful job, and I apologize. I kind of threw a lot at you there. But first of all, I just want to say I'm touched and honored that you'd share that with me, with us, with the audience. We're very glad that this was, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, it sounds like writing was very therapeutic. It sounds like writing helped really heal a lot of things that were going in your life. So, and of course, selfishly for me as a reader, I think you're brilliant writers. So I'm so happy that you decided to do that, because I get to share in the awesomeness of what you've created. I hear what you're saying about self-publishing and traditional publishing, and I know, definitely that could be a whole other 3 hours we talk about. But I will say though that I feel like and as someone who has no stake in the game and I think that your book is special, and it will reach its audience, and that I'm just glad you got it out, especially after so much time honing your craft and honing the shaping this book, that I'm glad that it got out. I'm so glad I got to read it this past year, and I'm glad that I can count it as one of the best books that I read in 2025. So kudos to you, and I'm sure there will be many more important people than me that will find that about your work, Sam. So thank you for sharing that
No,
part
that's
of.
very generous of you, PL. I really appreciate it. Yeah, that's I worked immensely hard, about 5,500 hours or 230 days of working 24/7. I did the math. That's a conservative estimate. So having somebody like yourself take the time to read it again in a relatively rough state too, when you did and still enjoy it, was immensely encouraging. I was quite concerned at about the 3/4 mark that I was going to put out a book that no one was going to find compelling. And so to have yourself, along with another person, my editor, read it and go, holy moly. And, I've read a lot of self-pub stuff too, to hear people who've also said, like, I've read a lot of self-pub. This doesn't feel like self-pub. This feels like a AAA production kind of thing. It means a lot to me, man. Your encouragement too throughout the last, even just the last couple months, really has been big. The support and everything. Yeah.
Well, you're certainly worth it, my friend. So again, thank you for that. And we still have, I hope you're willing to go a bit longer past the hour, just in terms of like, thank you for what you do with TAP. And I had the privilege of coming on your show. What was the genesis of that? What made you start a podcast to feature other creatives? Where can we find that? And is it still going on? Is it something that you paused? Like, can you tell us a bit about TAP?
Yeah, TAP is I'll just preface, I haven't done TAP in about 2 years because I guess we can get into it. I have a degree in anthropology. I was going to become a cultural anthropologist and ethnographer. And part of my education was ethnographic surveys, studying people at the sociocultural level, and just understanding what makes societies tick and what kinds of societal levers there are to, in some sense, motivate human beings to be good in society, to behave civilized. And it's part of the reason I wrote a book like Lions of Carthage, just because I wanted to see what that might look like in antiquity. But with the author's preface, it was an extension of it was a literary ethno-literary survey. I wanted to talk with authors and find out, and it wasn't even, I mean, you were on the show. It's not even so much about the story itself. It's more about your story, right? And the reason I focused on that, and I used Joseph Campbell's monomythic structure for it, I broke it down to 8 steps. It's more like the Disney Pixar version of how they tell the hero's journey, because the full one's like 20 steps. I wasn't going to do that to my guests. I wanted to figure out more about you, because that would inform the story you wrote, or stories you wrote. And I wanted to conduct an ethnographic survey there and find out why people do these things, because I'm always asking myself, why did they do that? Why did that happen? What do people do after herbicide? All kinds of stuff like that. So the genesis initially was that, but it became somewhat selfish, full disclosure, in that I did want to take a survey of people who are trad and self-publish or hybrid press and figure out, like, pros and cons here, man, because eventually this book's going to come out.
Yeah.
You should ask some people. So I talked with yourself, people like Ryan Cahill, a number of authors within our genre and beyond that. I talked with people who wrote romance, other historical fiction authors, though they didn't go quite as hyperbolic as I did. And the consensus, as I would ask people, sometimes after the show, the mics would go cold, I'd say, well, got this book. It's pretty thick. It's also pretty grim. I call it grim hope. I'm coining the term. It's grim hope. It's oxymoronic, but I do think the book is actually a quite hopeful one, and it leaves off in a way that I think thematically is resonant with people. But I asked people, and eventually, after telling them the book enough times, I just decided, oh, you're self-publishing, man. There's no way. Again, with the content in this book, the size, an unknown variable like myself, there's no way you're trad publishing this. Nobody's going to pick it up. And then on top of it, a lot of people just said, this book is a suitable candidate for self-pub for various good reasons. You don't have to compromise your integrity. You don't have to castrate this book in any way whatsoever. You can keep all the jagged, sharp parts. You don't have to sand it down at all. In other words, you don't have to self-censor. And as a big fan of the First Amendment in the United States, the freedom of expression, the last thing I want to do is neuter my art and defang it. So I just decided, after talking with all these people on tap and having really good really good conversations like what I had with yourself, and also just fellow history lovers, so that's always a treat. I had a couple more; they were really fun. I just talked with these people, learned so much, and decided at a certain point, I've learned that I am going to self-publish, which means I'm probably going to do it forever, because I'm not going to stop writing the kinds of books I write. They're grim hope. And but I also learned a lot about how, like I say, it's kind of the tagline, the slug line of the show, how authors are forged. And the overall consensus is, in a myriad of ways that are all fascinating and end up creating stories that are downstream of their experience and highly informative. And I think, much like Lines of Carthage, the exercise was also, if I'm talking about what I wanted people listening to get out of it, it was an exercise in empathy, to see that whether you came from a family where you were beaten as a child or had a perfectly normal nuclear family where everything was copacetic, everybody is capable of writing just about anything, and we don't need to go through certain things to produce great work. Conversely, a lot of people did, and it's worth generating empathy in understanding why people write, even if it's something you don't like. I've full disclosure, I've had guests on the show whose work I did not really care for, but the act of being empathetic toward them, because they clearly went through a lot to get to that point, even if it wasn't traumatizing or anything like that, was it was a good way to develop empathy in myself. And also, I think people who weren't aware of that sort of stuff were still listening to the podcast, and it's going like, wow, this person, they've experienced a lot and they've done something with it. One of the characters in the Lines of Carthage does something with their emotion, their catharsis. And I'm always looking at how empathy can be, in some sense, weaponized. And I can share that weapon with humanity and maybe affect some kind of change that improves the world a little bit. I rarely write for anybody, but if I do, it's at the macro scale to help generate empathy. So hopefully that answers your questions. I sort of meander.
No, it definitely did. And once again, thank you for what you do, what you've done with TAP. And I think I've listened to several of those episodes. I think they're brilliant. And I think what you're doing was there's you're a very humble guy. There's a lot of altruism in behind what you did. It wasn't just about you canvassing to figure out what avenue you used to publish. It was about the connection and about you giving back and providing a platform for authors. So, thank you for that. And I appreciate you being part of that, being part of that. I feel like, for it's horrible, it's terrible, but I can't help it. I'm going to do something here that, taking a page out of what is done in the, we're kind of, in a way, kind of semi-bashing a chat, but we don't mean to, because, I mean, we do understand, appreciate that it's obviously that's what kind of a viable way it is to publish books, and we have a lot of friends and associates that are traditionally published. And, I want to say this, that, TradPub does a lot of the comparative stuff where if you like this book and this author, you will like this book and this author.
Yeah.
And they're always trying to draw these, this is analogous to this. Well, this is how I feel. And it's funny you mentioned your background. So another fantastic author, perhaps he writes, in terms of scope, I think because, his world is completely made up, but it feels real. Of course, many parts of it is based on real history. But it's funny, you both have an anthropological background. I'm going to say for the audience, because unfortunately this is just the way it goes in terms of pitching a book. For me, pitching a book, who's not the author, if you like Malazan, Book of the Fallen, and that kind of scope,
Oh yeah.
By Stephen Erickson, of course, he, as many of us know, he does have an anthropological background. I think this is the type of book that you will enjoy. And we all know that Malazan, I think, is one of, I'd say that Stephen Erickson is iconic, and that body of work is iconic. And I can certainly see, Sam, that one day you could produce something similar.
Oh, that's high praise. Yeah.
Yes, I mean it.
I appreciate that. That's very generous of you to say. I began it, and I can't remember why, but I put it down. I have been meaning to, because if I recall, it's such a cryptic read, that immensely cryptic, and I enjoyed it, but I felt so adrift at times that I thought, I don't know if I'm ready for this yet. And I don't know that I ever will, but knowing that Erickson has an anthropological background, that's pretty cool. That makes me want to pick it up. But I don't know that I'll ever write big series. I really like Dan Simmons, who's written the Hyperion Cantos. He wrote a 2-book series called Ilium and Olympos, which is a reiteration, maybe kind of recreation of the Iliad, but with nanomachines, which is as cool as it sounds. And I don't know if I'll ever be a 9-book guy, a Sanderson style kind of person, but I really like succinct stories. I like that Lions of Carthage, whether or not it goes on to, if there's more stories in the Hannibalic epic, I like that you can just read that, technically one book, and get the whole story. So I appreciate the comparison, though. I don't know if I'll ever take on any epics in terms of not just the story, the scope and scale, but the actual book count, how much real estate it takes up on my shelf.
Well, again, I am wishing you every success. Again, you're a brilliant author and you're a wonderful person, and I'm better for having read your work. I hope to read more from you in the future. I know we're going over time here, but quickly, can you give us any idea, if you can? I understand you may not be able to divulge it, but what's next for Sam HALE in terms of your writing? Do you have any projects that you're able to share that are coming up? Or
I'm writing cozy fantasy next. So I'm not joking.
Wow.
It's called This Is Fantasy. It has there's a fair amount of meta commentary in it. The book is essentially split into 2, and I can't go into the second half so much, but what I can say is that the first book, the first half, that is a character named Zach in a world that uses paint and various forms of, say, drawing, stenciling, pretty much any kind of visual art to improve the world, to repair it. It takes place in like an early industrial era, rural area, kind of town. And Zach is from our world, our time, and is transported. That is portal fantasy, I guess you would say. And it's a wholesome world. It's cozy, it's safe, but does reveal that it too has warts. And Zach, who is a widower, is able to find some kind of closure in that world, and he does it through the arts, through painting in particular. And I have a character who's more or less Bob Ross in it, which was fun to write. But This Is Fantasy is meant to, I don't make it a self-insert, but the second half of TIFF has quasi-autobiographical elements to it that, while I don't feel are self-inserts, I think are poignant enough to help us understand Zach's experience and how we handle things like grief and closure, or the lack thereof. But I like TIFF a lot because I had been really concerned after 7 years of Locke that I wasn't able to write any other story. So after I gave that draft to you and my editor, Jen, I decided I'd just try TIFF out and wrote This Is Fantasy in about 2 weeks. It's like a 60,000 word. Yeah, which is twice as long as a chapter called Triumph in Lions of Carthage. So you double one chapter in Lions of Carthage, and it's a short novel. This is not what normal people do. And TIFF is fun. It's cozy. It has a great little magic system. It's quaint. It's rural. It's small scale in terms of scope. And thematically, it's something I feel as though is almost an extension of Locke in various ways. But also, it feels like an intensely personal story that, if for no other reason, I needed to tell, just because it just kept poking me in the back of the head and said, let's rock, man. So 2 weeks of writing it, did another draft, and then by then, my editor came back with Locke and the myriad of corrections and dire need of facilitation, and including writing a new chapter, which I wrote in about 25 minutes because I was so angry. I just and I did it. I hopped out of the shower and I was still in my towel. I'm like, fine. And I just did it. But yeah, the TIFF is on the board. I just published a short story that was a republish, I guess you'd say. It was initially in an anthology through this indie press, Inked in Gray. It was in an anthology called The First Stain. It was called Krov, Krov, which is Ukrainian for something like lifeblood. But I wrote it in about 2019, which is like 3 years preceding the Russian invasion of Ukraine. But it takes place, it's a Ukrainian guy who's scavenging in this unnamed city just to survive. And he uses blood magic to do that. And Krov just came out a couple days ago. It's only ebook. 5,000 words, which is half a Lines of Carthage chapter on average. So it took me about 5 minutes to write. No. And I'm proud of Krov, not because I feel like I'm vindicated in writing something where the story in Krov, the Russians invade Ukraine. I don't feel vindicated, and it's not something to celebrate, obviously. But I was always wondering whether or not Krov was an accurate portrayal of the civilians' plight. Again, what happens to normal people after the army comes in and or destroys everything? I always wondered if Krov was an accurate portrayal of the civilians' plight. And having a couple of years of hindsight now with the Russo-Ukrainian war, starting in 2014 and ramping up in 2022, I think I did an okay job. And that Krov, this is fantasy, and then a secret novel that, if I am successful, I think might do something pretty awesome to the written word. But I can't say that one. That's like my top secret project. Yeah.
Okay.
I got some stuff. I got some irons in the fire.
Well, that sounds amazing, and congratulations on the release of Krov. I can't lie to you. I got a little chill when you started talking about it, and that, it seemed like you're prescient about the war, like that. It just, I definitely have to check that out. And
well, I will say, I mean, it doesn't hurt that Russia annexed Crimea and then portions of Georgia preceding all this. So it was also a bit of like, well, what's the logical?
Exactly. You can draw a pretty straight line to the fact that it was probably going to happen at some point. You just couldn't predict when. So, but and I mean, I'm excited for you. Congratulations on the upcoming projects. I hope they go well too. I do plan to read more from you, of course, as much as I can, whatever you write. I want to give the opportunity, before we finish up, I just want to kind of give you the chance to tell people where they can buy your books, where they can follow you on social media, and that sort of thing.
Yeah. So primarily I'm on Amazon right now, largely because the ebook royalties are uncontestable. I only just figured out how to upload PDFs and everything to Ingram because they make it as obtuse and cryptic as they can. So if you're a Nook reader, for example, maybe within the next 2 to 3 weeks, Locke will be there. But I have everything pretty much on Amazon for the moment, Krov included. And then as far as finding me, I barely use social media. I kind of detest it, if I'm being honest, but apparently we all need it. And Sam Hale Author on Instagram, that's what it's called. Sam Hale Author on Facebook. I think that's really my only two platforms. I have a link tree, but it just tells you to go to all the places I just told you I'm at. I am on YouTube as far as Tap. Tap is on YouTube. It's on any podcatcher you pull up. I'm still keeping it up via Libsyn. Does a really good platform for podcasters. So if you want to listen to Tap, it's still there. I did a couple pods called Tap Outs, where it's just me talking about writing and certain things like the starving artist trope and how detrimental that is to one's artistic flourishing. And yeah, there's more stuff probably, but I'm so bad at this that I can't recall. I do have a website, samhale.com. I can't believe I got the domain name. But all samhale.com is going to do is tell you to go to these places to go buy the book. But there's a contact me section, which a bunch of AI bots have already spammed me, trying to get me to sign up for this for $500 and that. So I've been getting these great little emails that are far too well written from publicists. It is a treat. I will say, you can tell AI loves its M dashes, and that's coming from a guy who loves his M dashes. You can make a drinking game out of the M dashes and semicolons and lines of Carthage. So I think that's all the places you can find me.
Okay, fabulous. Yeah, I love those. I love the ones. I have the same thing on my website, and I get the ones where they actually are writing it to another author, but they just mistakenly sent it.
They used the wrong name the other day. Yeah, like, I got one of those the other day, and it was like the Forest of Darkness or something. And it's like spam.
Oh boy. But anyways, thank you for that. And this has been just a marvelous conversation. I've so enjoyed chatting with you. I hope you were doing the honor of coming back in the future. Down the road, and we can do this again. I'd love to chat to you again down the road in this format, and give a chance for Maya to know even more about a fascinating person and a brilliant author. So, but thank you so much for coming. Quickly, the shameless self promo for me. Quickly, PL Stewart, Drunk Game Sagas YouTube channel. PLStewart.com is the website. I'm on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, Blue Sky. Almost all my handles are at PL Stewart Writes. Before I go blog, where I'm an assistant editor, that's where I largely post my reviews. You can all see my Goodreads. Shout out to Beth Tavern, all the Before We Go blog crew, my peeps there. My other interview feature with my awesome partner on that feature made the pages. Check out her channel. She's a fabulous booktuber, where we do page chewing, which is another interview feature where we're kind of been on a hiatus right now, but meanwhile, I've been rocking the 6 Elemental interviews with fabulous creatives such as Sam. Finally, the Drunk Game Saga, the books, 7-book series, 5 books out. The most recent book, book 5, A Pack of Wolves, came out in spring of 2025. The 6th book, A Black Dragon on Red, is expected in the spring of 2026, and then God willing, I'll finish up the series in 2027. The only other thing quickly is Sam was speaking of anthologies. My story, Forest Dark in the Shapers of World Anthology, Volume 5. Amazing bunch of authors. Don't straight for my story. I mean, some fabulous authors in here, MJ Kuhn, etc. I know the season's kind of over, but if you want to see my first foray into not only short fiction but fantasy horror, that's linked to my Drunk Kingdom universe. I highly recommend you check it out, especially if you don't want to read chunky books like the ones in my regular series. If you're interested, yeah, if you're interested, Sam, I'll send you an arc. I think you might have fun with my story and a lot. But there's some great stories in there. But especially if you do anyone who plans to read my series, I think Forest Dark is an integral story that you should read to really add some value to your reading experience of my series. So. Yeah, I'll flip that to you, Simon. Whenever you get to it, but I think it's a lot of fun.
I almost forgot to mention I am on Goodreads too. Yeah.
Yes, Goodreads. Yes, of course. And you can see my quick review of Sam's books with the link to my top indie reads, science fiction, fantasy indie reads of 2025, on which Sam definitely made that list for Lines of Carthage, and again, it was fabulous. What a unique, brilliant piece of work that again, I can't wait to read more from him. So So for everyone who is going to catch this on replay, or everyone who was watching live, but just want to kind of hang out and watch rather than comment, thank you so much. You're what makes this type of long form content amazing. I don't care what anyone says. Long live long form content. It is the bomb. So for Sam and I, we're signing off, and thank you so much again, everyone, and we'll see you